In a leafy Portland suburb, an 80-year-old woman was about to face a confrontation she never saw coming. What started as a quiet Sunday drive in her new Tesla took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter's icy stare. Allison Thompson wasn't your typical grandmother. For over 60 years, she'd lived modestly, teaching piano and clipping coupons, known for her quiet strength and shrewd investments. When a deer crossed her path and forced her to brake, she had no idea she was about to collide with old grudges. Allison smiled, a gesture that would ignite a storm of emotions. What began as distance became revelation. The family would never be the same after pride met legacy in one unexpected moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the Tesla showroom cast everything in an almost ethereal glow, transforming the sleek vehicles into sculptures of possibility. Allison Thompson stood before a midnight blue Model S, her weathered hands pressed against the cool metal of her walker, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. At 80, she had long since stopped expecting surprises from herself. Her days had settled into comfortable routines: morning coffee on the terrace of her Cherry Hills Village home, afternoon therapy sessions, evening documentaries about climate change that left her feeling simultaneously educated and helpless. But here, surrounded by these silent sentinels of innovation, she felt a spark of something that reminded her of the woman who had built a real estate empire from nothing more than determination and a keen eye for undervalued properties. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" The voice belonged to James Chen, approaching with the measured pace of someone who had learned to read customers' moods. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had successfully reinvented his life once and wasn't afraid to do it again. His Tesla name tag hung slightly askew over a button-down shirt that had seen better days, the uniform of someone working multiple jobs with dignity intact. Allison turned toward him, noting the genuine warmth in his eyes. In her decades of business dealings, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between authentic interest and practiced sales technique. James fell distinctly into the former category. "I wasn't expecting to feel anything," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I came here because my therapist suggested I might benefit from taking action on my environmental concerns rather than simply worrying about them." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Though I suspect you already know that, Dr. Chen." James chuckled, the sound carrying the easy familiarity of their therapeutic relationship into this unexpected commercial context. "In here, I'm just James, the occasionally overeager Tesla salesman trying to pay off graduate school loans. Though I have to admit, seeing you in this setting gives me insight into something we've discussed: your tendency to process emotions through decisive action." The observation hung between them, neither uncomfortable nor intrusive, but weighted with the kind of understanding that comes from months of careful conversation. Allison had begun therapy 18 months ago, initially as a concession to her physician's concerns about depression, following what he diplomatically termed her recent losses. The losses, of course, were more accurately described as choices: the decision to finally cut ties with several toxic business relationships, the gradual withdrawal from social circles that had never offered genuine friendship, and most painfully, the acceptance that her relationship with her daughter Claire might never heal. "Tell me about this one," Allison said, running her hand along the car's smooth surface. The gesture was both practical, testing the reality of the machine, and sensual, the way someone might touch a piece of art they were considering for their home. James launched into the specifications with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in the product he was selling. The car could travel over 400 miles on a single charge. It accelerated from 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. The interior was crafted from sustainable materials. The software updated itself automatically, constantly improving the driving experience. But what captured Allison's attention wasn't the impressive statistics. She had enough money to buy impressive things whenever she wanted them. What moved her was James's description of the car's environmental impact, or rather, the lack thereof. No tailpipe emissions. A carbon footprint that decreased over time as the electrical grid became cleaner. The possibility of powering the vehicle entirely through solar panels, if she chose to install them. My carbon footprint, she repeated, testing the phrase. I've never thought about having one of those. Most people our age didn't, James replied, then caught himself. I mean, most people from earlier generations. The concept is relatively new in popular discourse. Allison smiled at his diplomatic correction. James, I'm 80 years old and I've survived the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and the invention of the Internet. I'm not offended by acknowledgments of my age. She paused, studying the car's interior through the open door. Though I am increasingly concerned about what I'm leaving behind. The admission surprised them both. In therapy, Allison had danced around the edges of legacy discussions, focusing instead on immediate relationship issues and coping strategies for what she insisted on calling her current life phase, rather than anything that suggested finitude. But something about this space, this temple to the future, made her feel safe enough to voice the fears that kept her awake at 3 a.m. Tell me more about that, James said, slipping unconsciously into his therapist voice. I built things, Allison said, her eyes distant. Shopping centers, office complexes, residential developments. I took empty land and turned it into places where people could live and work and shop. I thought I was contributing something positive to the world. She laughed, but the sound carried no humor. Now I watch documentaries about urban sprawl and wonder if I spent my career making the world worse. James leaned against the car beside her, a gesture that transformed their interaction from sales pitch to conversation. What would making it better look like now? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Allison had spent months in therapy exploring her regrets, her disappointments, her fears about aging and isolation. But this was the first time anyone had asked her what redemption might look like. I don't know, she said finally, but I think it might start with this car. The purchase process took 2 hours, during which Allison found herself sharing more about her motivations than she had intended. The Tesla wasn't just transportation, it was a statement. To herself, primarily, but also to anyone who cared to notice, that Allison Thompson was still capable of change, still willing to learn, still interested in being part of solutions rather than problems. The delivery can be arranged for Thursday, James said, reviewing the paperwork. Though I have to ask, and this is therapist James asking, not salesman James, have you thought about how this purchase might be perceived by people in your life? The question hit her like cold water. In her excitement about the car's environmental benefits and her own sense of renewal, she hadn't considered how the Tesla might look to others. Specifically, she hadn't considered how it might look to Claire. I don't have many people in my life to consider, she said carefully, but the ones you do have matter to you. Allison was quiet for a long moment, her pen hovering over the signature line. Claire lived less than 10 miles away, in a world where every dollar was scrutinized and stretched. A world where Allison's offers of financial help had been repeatedly rejected with increasing vehemence. The last conversation they'd had 5 years ago now had ended with Claire's voice rising to a shout. We don't need your money, Mom. We never needed your money. We needed you. The memory stung as sharply now as it had then, carrying with it all the accumulated weight of a relationship built on misunderstandings and poorly expressed love. Would Claire see the Tesla as another symbol of Allison's wealth and privilege? Another reminder of the gulf between their circumstances? Perhaps, Allison said slowly. Some perceptions can't be controlled. Perhaps the choice is between living according to other people's possible interpretations or living according to your own values. She signed the papers with a flourish that belonged to the woman who had closed million-dollar deals without hesitation. But underneath the confidence, she felt a flutter of uncertainty that had nothing to do with the purchase, and everything to do with the granddaughter she had never met, and the daughter who had chosen silence over reconciliation. As James processed the final paperwork, Allison walked once more around the Tesla that would soon be hers. In its perfect surfaces, she saw, reflected not just her own image, a small, elegant woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, but also the possibility of becoming someone different in whatever time she had left. Someone who chose action over regret, engagement over isolation, hope over despair. The car represented many things: environmental responsibility, technological progress, personal independence. But most of all, It represented choice. The choice to keep changing, keep growing, keep believing that it wasn't too late to become the person she had always wanted to be. "Congratulations, Allison," James said, extending his hand. "I think you're going to love it." As she shook his hand, Allison felt a surge of anticipation that reminded her of standing in front of her first property acquisition decades ago. The future was uncertain, potentially complicated, definitely challenging. But for the first time in years, it felt full of possibility. She just hoped that possibility was big enough to bridge the gaps she had spent too many years allowing to widen. The fluorescent lights of the Tesla showroom cast everything in an almost ethereal glow, transforming the sleek vehicles into sculptures of possibility. Allison Thompson stood before a midnight blue Model S, her weathered hands pressed against the cool metal of her walker, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. At 80, she had long since stopped expecting surprises from herself. Her days had settled into comfortable routines: morning coffee on the terrace of her Cherry Hills Village home, afternoon therapy sessions, evening documentaries about climate change that left her feeling simultaneously educated and helpless. But here, surrounded by these silent sentinels of innovation, she felt a spark of something that reminded her of the woman who had built a real estate empire from nothing more than determination and a keen eye for undervalued properties. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" The voice belonged to James Chen, approaching with the measured pace of someone who had learned to read customers' moods. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had successfully reinvented his life once and wasn't afraid to do it again. His Tesla name tag hung slightly askew over a button-down shirt that had seen better days, the uniform of someone working multiple jobs with dignity intact. Allison turned toward him, noting the genuine warmth in his eyes. In her decades of business dealings, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between authentic interest and practiced sales technique. James fell distinctly into the former category. "I wasn't expecting to feel anything," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I came here because my therapist suggested I might benefit from taking action on my environmental concerns, rather than simply worrying about them." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Though I suspect you already know that, Dr. Chen." James chuckled, the sound carrying the easy familiarity of their therapeutic relationship into this unexpected commercial context. "In here, I'm just James, the occasionally overeager Tesla salesman trying to pay off graduate school loans. Though I have to admit, seeing you in this setting gives me insight into something we've discussed: your tendency to process emotions through decisive action." The observation hung between them, neither uncomfortable nor intrusive, but weighted with the kind of understanding that comes from months of careful conversation. Allison had begun therapy 18 months ago, initially as a concession to her physician's concerns about depression, following what he diplomatically termed her recent losses. The losses, of course, were more accurately described as choices. The decision to finally cut ties with several toxic business relationships, the gradual withdrawal from social circles that had never offered genuine friendship, and most painfully, the acceptance that her relationship with her daughter Claire might never heal. "Tell me about this one," Allison said, running her hand along the car's smooth surface. The gesture was both practical, testing the reality of the machine, and sensual, the way someone might touch a piece of art they were considering for their home. James launched into the specifications with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in the product he was selling. The car could travel over 400 miles on a single charge. It accelerated from 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. The interior was crafted from sustainable materials. The software updated itself automatically, constantly improving the driving experience. But what captured Allison's attention wasn't the impressive statistics. She had enough money to buy impressive things whenever she wanted them. What moved her was James's description of the car's environmental impact, or rather, the lack thereof. No tailpipe emissions. A carbon footprint that decreased over time as the electrical grid became cleaner. The possibility of powering the vehicle entirely through solar panels, if she chose to install them. "My carbon footprint," she repeated, testing the phrase. "I've never thought about having one of those." "Most people our age didn't," James replied, then caught himself. "I mean, most people from earlier generations. The concept is relatively new in popular discourse. Allison smiled at his diplomatic correction. James, I'm 80 years old, and I've survived the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, and the invention of the Internet. I'm not offended by acknowledgments of my age. She paused, studying the car's interior through the open door. Though I am increasingly concerned about what I'm leaving behind. The admission surprised them both. In therapy, Allison had danced around the edges of legacy discussions, focusing instead on immediate relationship issues and coping strategies for what she insisted on calling her current life phase, rather than anything that suggested finitude. But something about this space, this temple to the future, made her feel safe enough to voice the fears that kept her awake at 3 a.m. Tell me more about that, James said, slipping unconsciously into his therapist voice. I built things, Allison said, her eyes distant. Shopping centers, office complexes, residential developments. I took empty land and turned it into places where people could live and work and shop. I thought I was contributing something positive to the world. She laughed, but the sound carried no humor. Now I watch documentaries about urban sprawl and wonder if I spent my career making the world worse. James leaned against the car beside her, a gesture that transformed their interaction from sales pitch to conversation. What would making it better look like now? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Allison had spent months in therapy exploring her regrets, her disappointments, her fears about aging and isolation. But this was the first time anyone had asked her what redemption might look like. I don't know, she said finally, but I think it might start with this car. The purchase process took 2 hours, during which Allison found herself sharing more about her motivations than she had intended. The Tesla wasn't just transportation, it was a statement. To herself, primarily, but also to anyone who cared to notice that Allison Thompson was still capable of change. Still willing to learn, still interested in being part of solutions rather than problems. The delivery can be arranged for Thursday, James said, reviewing the paperwork. Though I have to ask, and this is therapist James asking, not salesman James, have you thought about how this purchase might be perceived by people in your life? The question hit her like cold water. In her excitement about the car's environmental benefits and her own sense of renewal, she hadn't considered how the Tesla might look to others. Specifically, she hadn't considered how it might look to Claire. I don't have many people in my life to consider, she said carefully. But the ones you do have matter to you. Allison was quiet for a long moment, her pen hovering over the signature line. Claire lived less than 10 miles away, in a world where every dollar was scrutinized and stretched. A world where Allison's offers of financial help had been repeatedly rejected with increasing vehemence. The last conversation they'd had, 5 years ago now, had ended with Claire's voice rising to a shout. We don't need your money, Mom. We never needed your money. We needed you. The memory stung as sharply now as it had then, carrying with it all the accumulated weight of a relationship built on misunderstandings and poorly expressed love. Would Claire see the Tesla as another symbol of Allison's wealth and privilege? Another reminder of the gulf between their circumstances? Perhaps, Allison said slowly, some perceptions can't be controlled. Perhaps the choice is between living according to other people's possible interpretations or living according to your own values. She signed the papers with a flourish that belonged to the woman who had closed million-dollar deals without hesitation. But underneath the confidence, she felt a flutter of uncertainty that had nothing to do with the purchase and everything to do with the granddaughter she had never met, and the daughter who had chosen silence over reconciliation. As James processed the final paperwork, Allison walked once more around the Tesla that would soon be hers. In its perfect surfaces, she saw reflected not just her own image, a small, elegant woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, but also the possibility of becoming someone different in whatever time she had left. Someone who chose action over regret, engagement over isolation, hope over despair. The car represented many things: environmental responsibility, technological progress, personal independence. But most of all, it represented choice. The choice to keep changing, keep growing, keep believing that it wasn't too late to become the person she had always wanted to be. Congratulations, Allison, James said, extending his hand. I think you're going to love it. As she shook his hand, Allison felt a surge of anticipation that reminded her of standing in front of her first property acquisition decades ago. The future was uncertain, potentially complicated, definitely challenging, but for the first time in years, it felt full of possibility. She just hoped that possibility was big enough to bridge the gaps she had spent too many years allowing to widen. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness of Claire Martinez's cramped apartment at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before she had set it to ring. Ethan was already awake, of course. At 7 years old, her son operated on an internal schedule more precise than any timepiece, and Wednesday mornings meant exactly 43 minutes to complete his routine before they had to leave for school. Claire rolled out of bed and padded barefoot across the thin carpet, her joints protesting the movement. At 28, she felt decades older, worn down by the relentless mathematics of survival. How many hours of work equaled rent? How many cleaning jobs covered groceries? How many skipped meals meant Ethan could have his therapy sessions? Morning, baby, she whispered, finding Ethan exactly where she expected him, cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by library books about electric cars and renewable energy. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and his brown eyes, so much like her own, were already focused with the intensity that made his teachers call him gifted, and his former pediatrician use words like spectrum and special needs. Did you know, Ethan said without looking up, his finger tracing the outline of a Tesla Model S in one of his books, that electric cars don't produce any direct emissions? That means they don't make the air dirty like gas cars do. Claire smiled despite her exhaustion. This was how Ethan processed the world, through facts and figures that he collected like other children collected baseball cards. Yesterday, it had been the precise number of charging stations in Colorado. The day before, the efficiency ratings of different battery types. That's amazing, sweetheart, but remember, we need to get ready for school. Ethan nodded but didn't move, still absorbed in his book. Claire had learned not to rush this part. Transitions were hard for him, and Wednesday mornings were already complicated by the fact that his routine would be disrupted later. His occupational therapy session had been moved to Thursday because she couldn't afford this week's appointment until her weekend cleaning jobs paid out. The phone rang as she started coffee, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. Claire glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Sarah Morrison, her best friend since high school, calling at dawn because she knew Claire would be awake. You're up early, even for you, Claire said, cradling the phone against her shoulder while she measured coffee grounds with mathematical precision. Every scoop counted when the canister had to last 2 weeks. Ethan's therapy got moved again? Sarah's voice carried the particular brand of concern that came from watching your best friend struggle while feeling helpless to change anything. Just to Thursday. It's fine. Claire. Sarah's voice took on the tone that meant she was about to say something Claire didn't want to hear. This is the 3rd time this month. You can't keep playing scheduling roulette with his therapy because of money. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. I'm handling it. I know you are. You handle everything. That's the problem. Before Claire could respond, Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed in the same blue polo shirt and khaki pants he wore every Wednesday. His backpack was perfectly organized, his lunchbox already packed with the same peanut butter and jelly sandwich he ate every day. I'm ready, he announced, then paused. Mom, why do people drive cars that make the air dirty when there are cars that don't? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire knelt to his level, smoothing his hair, because electric cars cost more money, and not everyone can afford them. But the dirty air hurts everyone, Ethan said with the logic that made conversations with him both delightful and heartbreaking. Even the people who can't afford the clean cars. I know, baby. It's not fair. Sarah's voice drifted from the phone, still pressed against Claire's ear. Is that my favorite environmental scientist? Tell him I said Tesla just announced a new charging network. Ethan's eyes lit up. Tesla? The company that makes the Model S with the 400-mile range and the sustainable interior materials? Claire shot a look at the phone. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. Ethan's fascination with electric cars had started innocently enough, but lately it had become an obsession that felt dangerous in ways Claire couldn't articulate. Every book he checked out from the library, every documentary he watched, every fact he shared felt like a reminder of everything she couldn't provide for him. "We need to go," Claire said, ending the call perhaps more abruptly than necessary. The drive to Ethan's school took them through 3 distinct neighborhoods, each representing a different economic reality. Their apartment complex sat in the area where working families scraped by, where kids qualified for free lunch, and parents worked multiple jobs. The route passed through the middle-class suburbs where Claire cleaned houses on weekends, homes with driveways full of SUVs and landscaped yards that someone else maintained. Finally, they skirted the edge of Cherry Hills Village, where mansions hid behind iron gates, and money was never a source of anxiety. Claire tried not to look at the expensive homes, but Ethan pressed his face to the window whenever they passed this section. Not out of envy, but with the scientific curiosity he brought to everything. "I bet those big houses use a lot of electricity," he observed. "They should have solar panels." "Maybe they do," Claire said, though she doubted it. In her experience, people with enough money to solve problems rarely bothered to think about them. At school, Ethan's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, pulled Claire aside with the smile that meant good news and complicated implications. "Ethan's environmental science project is remarkable," she said, holding up a poster board covered in Ethan's careful handwriting and detailed drawings of electric vehicles. "The research is high school level. I'd like to submit it to the district science fair." Claire felt pride and panic in equal measure. "That's wonderful. What would that involve?" "Some additional research. Maybe a presentation. There might be opportunities for mentorship programs, summer camps for gifted students interested in environmental science." Opportunities. The word hung in the air like a promise Claire couldn't afford to make. Mentorship programs meant transportation costs. Summer camps meant fees and supplies and time off work she couldn't afford to take. "Let me think about it," Claire said, hating how the words tasted like failure. The rest of the day blurred together in the familiar rhythm of her Wednesday routine. Her job as a teacher's aide at the elementary school paid barely above minimum wage, but it allowed her to be near Ethan and have the same schedule. During lunch, she called 3 potential weekend cleaning clients, negotiating rates and schedules with the particular blend of professionalism and desperation that characterized her life. Rosa Martinez intercepted her in the apartment complex parking lot that evening, emerging from her own car with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided to have a difficult conversation. At 55, Rosa had the weathered hands of someone who had built her catering business one event at a time, and the direct gaze of someone who didn't waste time on polite evasions. She had appointed herself Claire's unofficial mother figure after Ethan's father left, a role Claire both appreciated and resented. "How's the boy?" Rosa asked, falling into step beside Claire. "Good. Excited about a science project." "And his therapy?" Claire's step faltered slightly. "What about it?" "Maria saw you at the clinic yesterday talking to the receptionist. She said you looked upset." Claire should have known. The Latino community in their complex was tight-knit, and news traveled fast. "Just a scheduling issue." Rosa stopped walking and fixed Claire with a look that had intimidated 3 generations of her own children. "Mija, pride is a luxury you can't afford. That boy needs his therapy." "He's getting his therapy. When you can pay for it," which isn't the same thing. They had reached Claire's apartment door, but neither woman moved to open it. In the distance, they could hear Ethan's voice through the thin walls, talking to himself about battery capacity and charging times. "I'm handling it," Claire said for the second time that day. Rosa shook her head. "Your mother has money." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. "Don't. She's tried to help. She's tried to control." Claire's voice rose before she caught herself, glancing toward the door where Ethan waited. "I won't have him thinking that love comes with conditions and price tags. And what if he thinks that pride is more important than his needs?" The question followed Claire into her apartment. where Ethan was waiting with 3 new library books about renewable energy and a smile that could break her heart with its innocence. As she helped him with homework and listened to his detailed explanation of wind turbine efficiency, Rosa's words echoed in her mind. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Claire sat at her kitchen table surrounded by bills and bank statements, doing the mathematics of survival once again. The therapy bills stared up at her, along with the electric bill, the car payment, and the grocery money that would have to stretch another week. In the living room, Ethan's library books lay spread across the coffee table, full of clean energy and innovative solutions and possibilities that felt as distant as the expensive homes in Cherry Hills Village. Her son was brilliant, curious, and deserving of every opportunity in the world. And she was failing him, one unpaid bill at a time. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome. Her mother's phone number was still programmed in her cell phone, unchanged after 5 years of silence. One call could solve everything. One conversation could open doors for Ethan that Claire's pride had kept locked, but it could also open wounds that had taken years to heal, and invite back into their lives the kind of conditional love that Claire had spent her adult years learning to live without. Outside her window, the city hummed with electric light and fossil fuel engines, and Claire wondered if some problems were too big for pride and too complicated for love to solve alone. The Tesla's collision with the aging Honda Civic was barely more than a tap, a gentle meeting of bumpers in the crowded pickup lane outside Riverside Elementary School. But the sound it made, that distinctive crunch of metal finding metal, cut through the afternoon chaos of children and parents and buses with startling clarity. Allison Thompson sat in the driver's seat of her 3-day-old Model S, her hands still gripping the wheel with the careful precision of someone who had spent her entire life being in control. The car's collision detection systems had already activated, the touchscreen displaying helpful information about impact assessment and emergency contacts. But all Allison could think about was how she had been distracted by the school building itself. A modest brick structure that looked nothing like the prestigious private academy where Claire had spent her childhood, but everything like the kind of place where real learning happened without the cushion of privilege. "Are you all right?" The other driver approached her window, a middle-aged man in work clothes whose primary concern seemed to be the functioning of both vehicles rather than the assignment of blame. His Honda bore the scars of previous encounters with urban driving, and his approach to this minor accident carried the weary practicality of someone for whom car troubles were a regular inconvenience rather than a crisis. Allison nodded, reaching for her insurance information with hands that trembled slightly. At 80, she had maintained her driving privileges through a combination of excellent reflexes and careful route planning, but this collision, however minor, felt like evidence of something slipping away from her control. "No damage to speak of," the man said after they had both examined their vehicles. "These new cars are built like tanks. My old Honda's been through worse." As they exchanged information, Allison became aware of the small crowd that had gathered to observe the minor drama. Children pressed against the school's chain-link fence, their faces animated with the particular excitement that comes from witnessing adult mishaps. Parents clustered in small groups, offering assistance and commentary in equal measure. And then she heard it, a voice that cut through 20 years of careful forgetting with surgical precision. "Ethan, stay close to me." Allison turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Claire stood 30 feet away, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a small boy whose dark hair and serious expression marked him unmistakably as family. Her daughter looked older than the mental photograph Allison carried, thinner, more worn, with the particular exhaustion that comes from years of carrying weight alone. But her posture was unmistakably Claire's, straight-backed, alert, ready for whatever challenge might present itself. The boy, Ethan, her grandson, whose name she knew only from carefully distant observation, was staring at the Tesla with an expression of pure wonder. His gaze traveled over the car's sleek lines with the intensity of someone cataloging every detail for future reference. "Mom," his voice carried clearly across the distance, "is that a Model S?" Claire's eyes followed her son's gaze to the Tesla, then traveled inevitably to the woman standing beside it. The moment of recognition hit both women simultaneously, a collision more devastating than the gentle meeting of metal and plastic that had brought them to this moment. Allison watched her daughter's face cycle through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, anger, and something that might have been longing before settling into the careful mask of controlled distance that Claire had perfected years ago. "Yes," Claire said to her son, her voice carefully neutral. "It's a Tesla." Ethan broke away from his mother's protective grip with the sudden movement of a child whose curiosity had overwhelmed his usual caution. He approached the car with the reverent steps of someone entering a cathedral, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that suggested both longing and restraint. "Excuse me," he said to Allison with the formal politeness that marked him as a child who had been carefully taught to respect adults. "Is this really a Model S with the long-range battery?" Allison looked into her grandson's face for the first time and saw her own eyes staring back at her. The same shade of brown, the same intensity, the same hunger for understanding that had driven her through decades of business deals and property acquisitions. But where her intensity had been shaped by Depression-era scarcity and hard-won success, his carried the pure joy of discovery. "Yes," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Yes, it is. Does it really have a 400-mile range? And can it accelerate from 0 to 60 in 1 second? And is the interior really made from sustainable materials?" The questions tumbled out of him with the enthusiasm of someone who had been storing them up for months, waiting for the chance to ask someone who might actually know the answers. Allison found herself smiling despite the complexity of the situation, charmed by his genuine excitement, and impressed by the sophistication of his questions. "Actually, this model can go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, she said, and the range is closer to 405 miles under optimal conditions." Ethan's eyes widened. "That's incredible! And it produces 0 direct emissions, right? That means it doesn't make the air dirty at all?" "That's right. And if you charge it with solar power, the whole system is completely clean." Claire's approach interrupted their conversation like a storm front moving across a clear sky. "Ethan, we need to go." Her voice carried the particular authority that mothers use when they need immediate compliance without argument. But Ethan was too absorbed in his first encounter with his automotive holy grail to read the warning signals. "Mom, this is a real Tesla. The lady said it can go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. That's faster than the specifications in my book." "Ethan." Claire's repetition of his name carried more weight, more warning, but she was looking at Allison now, and the expression on her face was complex beyond any single emotion. "Come on, Rosa is expecting us." Allison felt the moment slipping away from her like water through cupped hands. This boy, her grandson, was brilliant and curious and passionate about the very things that had driven her own recent transformation. The irony was almost unbearable. She had bought this car as a symbol of environmental consciousness and late-life change, and here was a child who understood its significance better than anyone in her own social circle. Claire. The name felt strange on her tongue after 5 years of silence. "He's remarkable." The compliment hit Claire like a physical blow. "Don't. He's clearly gifted. His questions about the technology." "I said don't." Claire's voice rose, drawing attention from the other parents still lingering in the pickup area. "We don't need your assessment. We don't need anything from you." The familiar refrain hung in the air between them, carrying all the weight of their shared history. But this time Ethan was there to hear it, his bright eyes moving between the two women with growing confusion. "Do you know my mom?" he asked Allison with the directness that children bring to complicated adult situations. The question created a silence that stretched like a canyon between them. Allison looked at Claire, seeing in her daughter's face the same protective fierceness that had once been turned toward her own childhood traumas, now redirected against the threat that Allison herself represented. "Yes," Allison said finally. "I do." Ethan processed this information with the careful consideration he brought to all new data. "Are you friends?" Another silence, shorter but somehow more painful. "We used to be," Allison said. Claire's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "Ethan, get in the car, now." This time, the authority in her voice penetrated even Ethan's excitement. He moved toward their aging sedan with obvious reluctance, turning back once to wave at Allison with the unself-conscious friendliness of a child who had found someone who shared his interests. "It was nice meeting you," he called out. "Maybe I can see your car again sometime." Claire's car door slammed with the finality of a vault closing. Through the windshield, Allison could see her daughter's profile, rigid with anger, and something that looked like fear. Ethan had twisted in his seat to continue staring at the Tesla, his face pressed against the back window as they drove away. Allison stood in the school parking lot long after the other cars had dispersed, long after the man with the Honda had driven away with a cheerful wave, long after the children had been collected and the afternoon had settled into the quiet that follows resolved chaos. Her hands shook as she got back into the Tesla, not from the minor accident but from the major collision of past and present that had just occurred. The car's systems cheerfully reported that no damage had been detected, and suggested several nearby service centers if she wanted a professional inspection. But Allison knew that some collisions leave marks that can't be measured by sensors or repaired by technicians. As she drove home through the neighborhoods that separated her world from Claire's, she carried with her the image of her grandson's face, bright with curiosity, unmarked by the bitterness that had grown between the adults in his life. For the first time in years, she had a clear picture of what she was fighting for. The question was whether it was already too late to win. The silence in Claire's apartment that evening felt different from the usual quiet that settled over their home after dinner. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his environmental science book spread before him as always, but his attention kept drifting to the window as if he expected to see the midnight blue Tesla materialize in their parking lot. "Mom," he said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when approaching subjects that might upset her. "Why were you angry at the lady with the Tesla?" Claire's hand stilled on the dishes she was washing. She had been dreading this question for the past 3 hours, ever since they'd left the school parking lot with Ethan's face pressed against the back window. In the rearview mirror, she had watched her son's expression shift from excitement to confusion to the kind of thoughtful processing that meant he was filing away adult behavior that didn't make sense to him. "Sometimes adults have complicated history," she said, keeping her voice neutral, but she knew about Teslas. She knew the real specifications, not just the ones from my books. Ethan's finger traced the outline of a Model S on the page before him. "She said if you charge it with solar power, the whole system is completely clean. Did you know that?" Claire dried her hands slowly, buying time. "Yes, sweetheart, I know that." "Then why don't we have one?" The question hung in the air with the particular weight that children's innocence brings to impossible adult realities. Claire sat down across from him, noting how small he looked, surrounded by books that represented dreams she couldn't afford to nurture. "Because they cost a lot of money. More money than we have." Ethan nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that broke Claire's heart regularly. At 7, he had already learned not to ask for things that were beyond their reach. But his next question caught her off guard. "Is the Tesla lady rich?" "Yes," Claire said carefully. "I think she is." "And you said you used to be friends. Were you friends when she was rich? Or did she get rich after?" Claire found herself caught between honesty and the simplified explanations that she usually relied on to navigate complex topics with him. How could she explain that Allison Thompson hadn't just been rich when they were friends, she had been Claire's mother? How could she describe the particular pain of growing up with everything money could buy except the thing she wanted most, a mother who was present instead of powerful? "She was always rich," Claire said finally. Ethan processed this information with his usual thoroughness. "Then why aren't you friends anymore? Did she do something bad?" The question pierced through years of careful emotional armor. Had Allison done something bad? Or had she simply done what successful people do? Prioritized achievement over relationships, business over bedtime stories, building an empire over building a connection with her daughter? "Sometimes people want different things," Claire said. "Sometimes those differences are too big to bridge, even when they care about the same important things, like helping the environment." Claire looked at her son, this brilliant, earnest child who saw the world in terms of problems that could be solved and systems that could be improved. In his universe, shared values were enough to overcome any obstacle. The simplicity of his worldview was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Environmental issues are important to you, she said, deflecting slightly. They're important to everyone. That's why I don't understand why people don't work together to fix them. Ethan closed his book with the decisive movement that meant he had reached a conclusion. I think you should be friends with the Tesla lady again. Ethan, she could teach me about electric cars, and maybe she has solar panels, and maybe she knows other people who care about the environment. His eyes lit up with the enthusiasm that made his teachers use words like gifted and advanced. Maybe she could help with my science fair project. Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Ethan's dreams collided with their financial reality. The science fair project that Mrs. Rodriguez wanted to submit. The mentorship programs and summer camps that could nurture his gifts. The opportunities that existed just beyond their reach, separated by a gap that pride and poverty had carved between them and the resources that could change everything. Baby, it's not that simple. But why not? If she likes Teslas and I like Teslas, and you both care about the environment, why can't we all be friends? The phone rang before Claire could attempt an answer, cutting through the conversation with shrill insistence. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and Claire grabbed it gratefully. You sound terrible, Sarah said without preamble. What happened? Claire glanced at Ethan, who had returned to his books but was clearly listening. Can I call you back later? Is Ethan okay? He's fine. We just ran into someone today. There was a pause, and Claire could practically hear Sarah's mental calculations. Someone from before? Yes. Oh, honey. Do you want me to come over? Claire looked around their small apartment, at the bills stacked on the counter, at Ethan's library books spread across every surface, at the life she had built through sheer determination and careful budgeting. It was a good life, she reminded herself. A life where love wasn't conditional and support didn't come with strings attached. But watching Ethan's face as he studied pictures of clean energy solutions, she wondered if her definition of a good life was enough for him. If her hard-won independence was worth more than his unrealized potential. Not tonight, she told Sarah, but maybe. Maybe we need to talk tomorrow. After she hung up, Ethan looked at her with the serious expression that made him seem older than his 7 years. Mom? If someone wanted to help us, and it would be good for the environment, would that be okay? The question felt like a test she wasn't prepared to take. What do you mean? I mean, if helping us also helped the planet, would that make it okay to accept help? Claire stared at her son, wondering when he had become wise enough to identify the intersection of her pride and his future. Outside their window, the city hummed with the energy of 1,000 compromises, and she realized that some bridges couldn't stay burned forever, not when crossing them might light the way for the next generation. Part 9. Allison Thompson hadn't slept well in years, but Thursday night's insomnia felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighed down by regret. She sat in the conservatory of her Cherry Hills Village home, the Tesla's keys resting on the glass table beside her untouched evening tea, and watched the pre-dawn darkness gradually surrender to morning light. The collision at the school had replayed in her mind dozens of times, but not the gentle meeting of metal and plastic. Instead, she found herself returning to the moment when Ethan's face had lit up at the sight of the Tesla, to the sophisticated questions that had tumbled from his 7-year-old mouth, to the pure joy he had radiated when discussing clean energy technology. Her grandson was exceptional. Even in their brief encounter, that much had been unmistakably clear. The depth of his questions, the way he processed complex information, the passionate intensity with which he approached environmental issues, all of it spoke to a mind that deserved every opportunity to flourish. And Claire was clearly struggling to provide those opportunities alone. The thought came with a familiar pang of guilt. For 5 years, Allison had honored her daughter's demand for distance, respecting Claire's fierce independence even as it meant missing every milestone in Ethan's young life. She had told herself it was what Claire wanted, what Claire needed to build her own life free from the complicated legacy of their relationship. But yesterday had revealed the cost of that distance, not just to herself but to a brilliant child, whose potential was being constrained by circumstances beyond his control. At 6:30 a.m., Allison made a decision that would have shocked the woman she had been just a week earlier. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. James Chen speaking. His voice carried the professional alertness of someone accustomed to early morning crisis calls. James, it's Allison Thompson. I hope I'm not calling too early. There was a brief pause as he shifted from therapist mode to whatever this conversation might require. Not at all. Is everything all right? How are you adjusting to the Tesla? The car is wonderful. But I need to talk to someone about a family situation that's developed. Are you available for an emergency session? Of course. I have an opening at 8 this morning, if that works. 2 hours later, Allison sat in James's office, the familiar space feeling both comforting and strange after encountering him in his Tesla salesman role. She found herself studying his face, trying to reconcile the man who had sold her a car with the therapist who had guided her through 18 months of careful emotional archaeology. Yesterday I met my grandson for the first time, she began, and watched James's eyebrows rise slightly. In all their sessions, she had mentioned Claire only in passing, usually in the context of relationship losses that couldn't be repaired. Tell me about that encounter. Allison described the minor accident, Ethan's excitement about the Tesla, Claire's protective anger, and the brief but revealing conversation that had followed. As she spoke, she found herself focusing not on the pain of seeing Claire's continued hostility, but on the memory of Ethan's bright curiosity. He's gifted, James. Truly gifted. His questions about the technology were more sophisticated than most adults could ask. His passion for environmental issues is genuine and informed. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And Claire is raising him alone, clearly without adequate resources. James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What are you thinking about doing? I want to help. Not just financially, though obviously I could solve their immediate problems. I want to be part of his life. I want to nurture his gifts, expose him to opportunities, help him reach his potential. And Claire's feelings about that? Claire made it clear 5 years ago that she didn't want my help or my involvement. But Ethan isn't Claire. He's a child with extraordinary potential who shouldn't be limited by adult conflicts he had no part in creating. James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in the gesture that meant he was working through the therapeutic implications of what she was proposing. Allison, I'm hearing a lot of focus on Ethan's gifts and potential. What about your own needs in this situation? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? You've spent months in therapy working through issues of legacy, meaning environmental responsibility. Yesterday, you encountered your daughter and grandson for the first time in years. There must be emotions beyond your assessment of Ethan's academic potential. Allison felt something crack open in her chest. A dam that had been holding back feelings she hadn't allowed herself to examine. I loved holding him when he was born, she said quietly. For those first few months, before everything fell apart with Claire, I thought I might get a second chance. A chance to be the kind of grandmother I hadn't managed to be as a mother. And now I see this brilliant child who shares my eyes and my intensity, who cares about the same things I've learned to care about, and I think maybe it's not too late. Her voice caught. Maybe there's still time to be useful to someone who matters. James nodded slowly. What would useful look like? Scholarships for summer programs. Mentorship in environmental science. Access to resources that could help him develop his gifts. Maybe, she hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe a chance to show him that caring about the environment isn't just about reading library books and dreaming about Tesla cars. Maybe a chance to show him what action looks like. And if Claire refuses? Allison looked out the office window, where morning traffic moved in patterns as predictable as her own daily routines had been before the Tesla changed everything. Then I'll have to find another way. This isn't about Claire anymore, James. This is about a child who deserves every opportunity, and a grandmother who finally understands what her legacy should be. The session ended with homework that felt more like a mission. draft a letter to Claire that focused not on past grievances or personal needs, but on Ethan's future and the concrete ways Allison could contribute to it. As she drove home in the Tesla, Allison found herself taking a detour through Claire's neighborhood, past the modest apartment complex where her daughter and grandson were probably starting their Thursday morning routine. She didn't stop, didn't linger, but she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of morning, one where she might be part of that routine, where Ethan's questions about clean energy could be answered with field trips to solar installations rather than library books. The Tesla's navigation system cheerfully recalculated her route home, but Allison knew that some journeys couldn't be mapped by satellites or measured in miles. Some distances could only be crossed one difficult conversation at a time, and for the first time in years she was ready to take that first step. Part 10. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning, slipped under Claire's apartment door while she was getting Ethan ready for his rescheduled occupational therapy session. She almost stepped on the cream-colored envelope in her rush to gather insurance cards and therapy notes. But something about the quality of the paper, expensive, substantial, made her pause. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized, despite 5 years of trying to forget it. Allison's penmanship remained unchanged, precise, elegant, the script of someone who had learned to write when such things mattered. "Mom, are you okay?" Ethan stood in the doorway, his backpack perfectly organized for their morning appointment, his face showing the concern that children develop when they learn to read their parents' moods as survival skills. "I'm fine, baby. Just getting something from a neighbor." Claire slipped the envelope into her purse, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you ready to go see Mrs. Patterson?" The drive to the therapy clinic usually provided Claire with time to mentally prepare for the session, reviewing Ethan's progress, thinking through questions for the occupational therapist, calculating how many more sessions they could afford this month. But today, the letter in her purse seemed to pulse with possibility and threat in equal measure, making concentration impossible. Mrs. Patterson greeted Ethan with the warm professionalism that had made her Claire's favorite among the rotating cast of specialists they had worked with over the years. At 60, she had the patient demeanor of someone who understood that progress came in small increments, and the practical wisdom to celebrate victories that other people might not even notice. "How has his fine motor coordination been this week?" she asked Claire as Ethan settled into his preferred spot at the therapy table. "Good. Better, I think. He's been writing more, and his letters are getting more consistent." Claire tried to focus on the conversation, but her awareness kept drifting to her purse, to the letter that felt like a small bomb waiting to explode her carefully constructed life. "That's excellent progress. His grip strength has improved significantly since we started working together." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried genuine enthusiasm. "I'd like to discuss some additional exercises we could incorporate. Maybe some activities that build on his interests in science and technology." The mention of Ethan's interests sent a jolt through Claire. 3 days had passed since the encounter in the school parking lot, and Ethan had mentioned the Tesla and the nice lady in every conversation since. His questions had grown more sophisticated, his research more intense, as if meeting someone who actually owned an electric vehicle had transformed his theoretical interest into burning curiosity. "Actually," Mrs. Patterson continued, "I've been meaning to ask if you've considered some of the STEM enrichment programs for gifted children. There are several in the Denver area that focus on environmental science, and they could provide wonderful outlets for Ethan's interests, while also supporting his sensory and motor development." Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Those programs, they must be expensive. Some are, but there are also scholarship opportunities, especially for children from single-parent households. I could provide some information if you're interested. Claire's hand moved unconsciously to her purse. "Let me think about it." During the session, Claire watched through the observation window as Ethan worked with Mrs. Patterson on fine motor exercises disguised as scientific experiments. His face lit up as he used tweezers to sort different types of recyclable materials, his concentration absolute as he practiced letter formation by labeling diagrams of solar panels. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even in occupational therapy, her son's world revolved around the environmental themes that had apparently captured Allison's attention as well. It was as if the universe was conspiring to remind her that some connections couldn't be severed simply through force of will. After the session, Claire sat in her car in the clinic parking lot. Ethan buckled into his booster seat and already absorbed in a new library book about wind energy. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope, her heart hammering against her ribs. The letter was 2 pages long, written on stationery that probably cost more than Claire's grocery budget for a week. But the content was nothing like what she had expected. Dear Claire, I won't pretend this letter isn't difficult to write, or that I have any right to insert myself into your life after respecting your wishes for distance for 5 years. But Wednesday's encounter with Ethan has made it impossible for me to remain silent about opportunities that could benefit him. Your son is extraordinary. In our brief conversation, he demonstrated knowledge of environmental technology that surpassed many adults I know. His questions were sophisticated, his enthusiasm genuine, and his understanding of complex systems remarkable for any age, let alone 7 years old. I am writing not as your mother, but as someone who recognizes exceptional potential and has the resources to nurture it. I am offering to establish an educational fund for Ethan, not as charity, but as an investment in a brilliant mind that could contribute significantly to solving the environmental challenges he clearly cares about deeply. This fund would cover enrichment programs, summer camps focused on environmental science, educational materials, and eventually college expenses related to STEM fields. The only condition would be that the programs chosen would need to align with developing his obvious gifts in environmental science and technology. I understand your concerns about accepting help from me. I understand the history that makes this offer complicated. But Ethan didn't create that history, and he shouldn't be limited by it. His potential is too important, his mind too valuable, to be constrained by adult conflicts he had no part in creating. I am also willing to contribute to his occupational therapy expenses, if that would be helpful. Mrs. Patterson comes highly recommended, and consistent therapy seems crucial for his development. Claire's hands stilled on the letter. How did Allison know about Mrs. Patterson? How did she know about the occupational therapy at all? The second page provided the answer. I hope you won't see this as an invasion of privacy, but I have made some discreet inquiries about Ethan's needs and your circumstances. Not to judge or interfere, but to understand how I might be most helpful. I know about the science fair project that Mrs. Rodriguez would like to submit. I know about the gifted programs that could nurture his interests. I know about the financial constraints that make these opportunities challenging. I am proposing a meeting. Neutral ground, perhaps with a mediator if that would make you more comfortable. Not to relitigate the past, but to discuss Ethan's future. To explore ways that my resources could support his development without compromising your autonomy as his mother. I have enclosed information about several programs that might interest him, along with a check to cover his next 3 months of occupational therapy. Please consider this not as an attempt to buy access to my grandson, but as an investment in a child whose potential should not be wasted. If you decide you want to meet, James Chen has agreed to facilitate a conversation if that would help. His number is included below. I am not asking for forgiveness or expecting reconciliation. I am asking for the chance to contribute to raising a remarkable child who happens to share my commitment to environmental responsibility. With respect for your decision, whatever it may be, Allison Claire stared at the check that had fallen from the envelope. 3 months of occupational therapy. More money than she typically saw in a single payment. Enough to solve the scheduling juggling act that had been keeping her awake at night. Mom? Ethan's voice came from the back seat. Is something wrong? Claire looked in the rearview mirror at her son's concerned face. At 7, he had already learned to read the subtle signs of adult stress, to monitor the emotional weather around him for storms that might affect his small world. No, baby. Everything's fine. She folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. Ethan, if someone wanted to help you learn more about environmental science, like maybe visit places where they make solar panels or wind turbines, would that interest you? His face lit up like sunrise. Really? Could we do that? Maybe. It's just something I'm thinking about. As they drove home, Claire found herself seeing their route through new eyes. The modest apartment complex where they lived. The neighborhoods they passed through on the way to Ethan's school, the distance, measured in more than miles, between their world and the resources that could transform her son's future. For 5 years, she had built their life on the principle that love and determination were enough. That Ethan didn't need anything she couldn't provide through hard work and careful budgeting. That accepting help from Allison would compromise something essential about their independence. But watching Ethan's excitement about the possibility of real environmental science experiences, Claire wondered if her pride was becoming a luxury they couldn't afford. If her hard-won independence was worth more than her son's unrealized potential. The letter sat in her purse like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. But for the first time in 5 years, she was beginning to consider that some bridges might be worth the risk of crossing, especially when the destination held possibilities too important to ignore. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Claire sat at her kitchen table with Allison's letter spread before her, surrounded by information about STEM programs and environmental camps she had never dared to consider. The future looked different than it had that morning. Broader, brighter, and terrifyingly uncertain. But for her son, uncertainty might be worth it. Part 11 ending. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October Saturday that painted the Colorado foothills in shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of the Thompson family stood together at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden. The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of winter, but inside the visitor center, the atmosphere hummed with the electricity of possibility. The photovoltaic cells convert sunlight directly into electrical energy through the photoelectric effect, Dr. Sarah Kim explained to her small tour group, which consisted of an 80-year-old woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes, a 28-year-old mother whose wariness was gradually giving way to cautious optimism, and a 7-year-old boy whose questions had already impressed 3 different research scientists. Ethan's hand was pressed against the glass display case containing various solar cell prototypes, his face lit with the particular joy that came from seeing theoretical knowledge transformed into tangible reality. Dr. Kim, what's the efficiency rating of the perovskite cells compared to the silicon ones? Dr. Kim smiled, clearly delighted by the sophistication of the question. The perovskite cells we're developing here are achieving efficiency rates of nearly 30% in laboratory conditions, compared to about 22% for commercial silicon cells. That's a 36% improvement. Ethan's mental calculations were instant and accurate. Will they be commercially available soon? We're hoping for market introduction within the next 5 years, assuming we can solve some durability issues. Claire watched her son's animated conversation with the research scientist and felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained over their lives for so many years. This wasn't charity or condescension. This was her brilliant child, being treated as the exceptional mind he was, his curiosity respected and nurtured by people who understood the significance of his questions. Allison stood a few steps away, her own attention divided between Ethan's obvious joy and Claire's gradually relaxing posture. The meeting James had facilitated 2 weeks earlier had been careful, formal, focused strictly on Ethan's educational opportunities. But this field trip, the first of several Allison had proposed, felt different. Less like a negotiation and more like a beginning. Grandma Allison, Ethan said, turning toward her with the easy familiarity that had developed over their 3 supervised visits. Did you know that if we covered just 4% of the Sahara Desert with solar panels, we could power the entire world? The title still caught both women off guard. Ethan had begun using it spontaneously after their second meeting, when Allison had explained the technical specifications of her Tesla's battery system with the patience and precision that his questions deserved. Claire had started to correct him, but something in her son's face, a happiness she hadn't seen since his father left, had stopped her. I didn't know that specific statistic, Allison replied. But it doesn't surprise me. Solar has incredible potential that we're just beginning to tap. The challenge, drive, Kim interjected, is energy storage and transmission. We can generate enormous amounts of clean energy, but getting it where it needs to go when it needs to be there, that's the real frontier. Ethan nodded seriously. That's why battery technology is so important. Like the lithium-ion batteries in Teslas, but better. Maybe solid-state batteries or even hydrogen fuel cells for large-scale storage. Claire found herself smiling despite her lingering reservations. Her son was having a conversation about cutting-edge energy technology with a PhD researcher and holding his own. This was what his teachers meant when they used words like gifted and exceptional. This was what she had been trying to nurture with library books and documentaries, but which required resources and connections she couldn't provide alone. The tour continued through laboratories where scientists worked on wind turbine efficiency, biofuel development, and energy grid optimization. Ethan absorbed everything with the intensity of someone who had found his calling, asking questions that impressed the researchers and taking notes in a small notebook Allison had given him, his first field research journal. During lunch in the facility cafeteria, Claire found herself in the surreal position of having a normal conversation with her mother for the first time in 5 years. Not about their past, not about grievances or misunderstandings, but about Ethan's future and the practical logistics of nurturing his gifts. The environmental science camp at Colorado State has rolling admissions, Allison said, consulting a folder of information she had assembled. They focus on renewable energy systems and sustainable technology. It's a 3-week program next summer. 3 weeks is a long time, Claire said automatically, then caught herself. 3 weeks was nothing compared to the opportunities it could provide. They have partial and full scholarships available. And I've spoken with the director. They're very interested in meeting Ethan after I described his background knowledge. Ethan looked up from his sandwich, his eyes bright with possibility. Would I get to work with real solar panels? And maybe visit wind farms? According to their curriculum, yes. Plus laboratory time, field research, and mentorship with graduate students working on renewable energy projects. Claire watched her son's face and saw her own childhood passion for learning reflected there, but without the loneliness that had characterized her own academic pursuits. Ethan would have support, encouragement, and resources that she had never been able to provide. Mom, Ethan said, turning to Claire with the serious expression that meant he was about to say something important. This is the best day I've ever had. Thank you for saying yes. The simple gratitude in his voice nearly undid her. Claire realized that her resistance to Allison's help hadn't been protecting Ethan, it had been limiting him. Her son didn't care about the complicated history between the adults in his life. He cared about solar cells and wind turbines, and the possibility of contributing to solutions for problems he already understood better than most adults. You're welcome, baby, she said, her voice catching slightly. As they walked back to the parking lot, Ethan ran ahead to examine the solar panels that powered the visitor center, his notebook out, and ready for more observations. Claire and Allison found themselves walking together for the first time, without the protective buffer of James's mediation or the formal structure of scheduled meetings. He's remarkable, Allison said quietly, truly exceptional. You've done an incredible job raising him. The compliment hit Claire differently than it had at the school parking lot 3 weeks earlier. This time, it felt like recognition rather than judgment, appreciation rather than assessment. Thank you, Claire said simply. They walked in silence for a moment, watching Ethan document the specifications of the solar installation with the thoroughness of a professional researcher. I won't pretend this isn't complicated, Claire said finally. There's a lot of history between us that can't be erased by field trips and scholarship funds. I know, Allison replied. I'm not asking for erasure. I'm asking for the chance to be useful to him. To be the grandmother I wasn't able to be as a mother. Claire studied her mother's profile, noting the lines that hadn't been there 5 years earlier, the subtle changes that spoke of age and perhaps wisdom. He adores you already, the way he looks at you when you explain how things work. He's never had that before, someone who takes his questions seriously and has the knowledge to answer them. He takes after you, Allison said. The intensity, the need to understand how systems work. You were like that as a child before things got complicated, Claire finished. Yes, Ethan called out from the solar array, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Grandma Allison, Mom, these panels are 30% more efficient than the ones in my book. The technology is changing so fast. Both women smiled at his enthusiasm, and in that moment, Claire felt something shift permanently in her understanding of their situation. This wasn't about her relationship with her mother, or about pride, or about the wounds they had inflicted on each other over the years. This was about a brilliant child who deserved every opportunity to flourish, and two adults who had finally found common ground in wanting to provide those opportunities. Okay, Claire said, the word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Let's try this. Not just the summer camp, but all of it. The programs, the mentorship, the resources he needs. But I need to be involved in every decision. I need to remain his primary advocate and decision maker. Allison nodded immediately. Of course. I'm not trying to replace you, Claire. I'm trying to support you. As they reached their cars, Claire's aging sedan and Allison's gleaming Tesla parked side by side, Ethan bounded over with his notebook full of observations and his face bright with the particular happiness that comes from a day of pure discovery. Can we come back here? He asked, looking between the two most important adults in his life. Can this be the first stop on my career as an environmental scientist? Claire and Allison exchanged a look over his head, a moment of shared understanding that transcended their complicated past and focused on their mutual investment in his extraordinary future. Yes, they said simultaneously, their voices harmonizing for the first time in years. As they drove away in separate cars but toward the same destination, a future where Ethan's potential could be fully realized, Claire found herself thinking about bridges. Some could be rebuilt, others could be reinforced, and a few, if you were lucky, could carry more weight than they had ever been designed to bear. In her rearview mirror, she could see the Tesla following at a respectful distance, and ahead of her, a road that looked different than it had that morning. Broader, brighter, and full of possibilities that none of them had imagined when this journey began with a minor collision in a school parking lot and a child's wonder at seeing his dreams made manifest in midnight blue metal and electric possibility. The future, Claire realized, was big enough for all of them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.